Yeah, let's.
Do you mind if you record this?
Sure, that's fine.
Yep, sure. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Stephen Cohen to King's India Institute. Steve doesn't need any introduction from me. His contributions to the study of South Asian security is immense, but it's also something which I think can be summarized quite easily, which is to say that quite simply, Steve practically created the field of South Asian security studies. To paraphrase what Voltaire said of God, if Steve didn't exist, we had to invent him ourselves. So, Steve is going to talk today about his forthcoming book, which is titled Shooting for a Century, which is coming out from Brookings Press very soon. And he tells me that it's a culmination of more or less a lifetime's engagement with the subcontinent. Yeah. We are delighted to have you here, Steve. The floor is yours.
Okay. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm astonished that so many people have come. I wouldn't be here myself had I not been the speaker, perhaps, on a Friday afternoon, but really appreciate it. I spent a lot of time here, and especially across the street, trying to get a visa out of the Indian government. When I came to London in 1963, uncertain as to whether I ever get to India, but the topic picked up, that was the Indian Army. And my strategy was to work on the Army and then to broaden myself to look at Indian strategic relations, because armies face inward and they also face outward. So I met Michael Howard here. I would come here. I'd go across the street to LSE, and of course I'd work in the public records office and the India Office Library up the street. So this old territory for me. I'm glad to see it's changed a lot. This book, so therefore, sort of culminates 50 years of research, beginning almost this month, 50 years ago. So I'll go through some slides, which I do not like, but it's a good way of summarizing what I wanted. The book, which should be coming out. I'm going to get I'm going to get edited text soon, and then we'll go to Galley. But Brookings is very quick. It begins with a couple of epigraphs. One by Mayor Daley of Chicago. What keeps people apart? Their inability to get together. That's all you needed to know. My favorite one I just discovered. Peace is the period of cheating between two periods of war. And the reason the book is titled The India-Pakistan Conundrum, no subtitle, A Search for Peace, that it's not about peace, it's about normalcy. There's a whole peace literature, which I do not get into except casually, but I think normal relations are a big enough ambition, and not terribly optimistic about normal relations. So let me go through the slides and begin with, the book doesn't do this, but I thought for this presentation it would be useful. Nuclear weapons make this the most dangerous place on earth. We've heard several American presidents say this. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's at least a half-truth. These may be myths or half-truths. Kashmir is the central cause of the conflict. You solve Kashmir, and you eliminate one of the world's great danger spots. Well, Anatol, great to see you. How you been? Yes. I've been pushing your book. So that's at best a half-truth about the centrality of Kashmir. Pakistan is about to crumble. It's going to disappear. All India needs to do is wait. No need to make concessions. You hear that from some hardline Indians. Another view, quite different view, is economic trade or track 2 activities are the road to peace in South Asia. And that's another school of thought, both in India and in Pakistan, and also the United States and maybe Norway, where I'm going soon. India-Pakistan relations are rooted in deep civilizational differences. They will not be resolved except by force. Again, that's probably both Indian and Pakistani extreme view on both sides. Now, these are at best half-truths, but I think if they're pursued to their logical conclusion, they wind up nowhere. That is, none of these really work very well. So next slide. The book begins with a discussion of the region, briefly. Now, I'm not a historian, although it turns out I'm an accidental historian. So next slide. Really talk about 3 different aspects of the region early in the first chapter to sort of set the framework. There have been many countries in South Asia have also been a few countries in South Asia. The Guptas and the Mauryas and so forth. Most of you know your history better than I do. They sort of integrated the region. The Raj integrated it, the Mughals integrated it. But on the other hand, there have been periods where it's been divided up. And that table chart is the best one I could get, but the University of Chicago Atlas of South Asia is now online. I'm going to look at that again. But this is by an earlier geographer. And that shows the thickness of the lines indicates the permanence of the boundary. So it's kind of interesting to see that there's obviously a north-south division, but also divisions in the south and north. Next slide. An interesting figure I came across was from the Economist website, or the Economist Intelligence Group. South Asia is the third most violent region in the world. People get excited when I say that. But if you take a measure, they take 23 different measures, whether it's domestic violence in each of the countries or violence between the states. It's the third most violent region in the world. And a lot of that probably is jacked up because of the nuclear weapons in both India and Pakistan. You can look at it's online. You don't like the variables. You can pick your own, but it's quite startling to see that figure. Next one. This is from the World Bank. It's the least integrated region in economic terms in the world. I think that's self-evident. It's not self-evident, but it's quite stunning. That wasn't true before independence, and even I'd say 47, 55, the first 9 years of it after independence. When I lived in Delhi, 63, I could still buy things that were made in Pakistan, newspapers, fairly freely without any trouble. The 55 crisis have slowed things down to 60. But then, as time went on, for every crisis, both governments clamped down on trade between them. Next slide. So that's it. There's a discussion in the book, this old stuff for most of you. The two states, ecologies, energy problems, ethnic and linguistic overlap is considerable, no question about it. This is denied by some people, especially in Pakistan right now, in India. Actually, I'm reading a novel which discusses this at great length. It's really, I'm not a great literary critic. City of Devi by Manil Suri. It's about my book. And it's about Hindu-Muslim relations in India, India-Pakistan relations. The book will get him in trouble with Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. And that's why he lives in America. It's a startling book. The domestic politics interact, and there's a long discussion in there. Actually, Sunil Puri's book covers this, about the role of Muslims in India. And people haven't talked about it the way they should, I think. It does affect the Indian in relations with Pakistan in many ways. There's no counterpart Hindu minority in Pakistan, but still the way Pakistan treats its minorities affects the Indians. So the behavior in the two countries interact. And I heard this from, I think, Paul Brass about 25, 30 years ago. My domestic politics is your security policy, and I think that's true in South Asia, and applies, of course, to Sri Lanka and the Tamil community and Bangladesh and so forth. The conclusion of the chapter, a couple of chapters, is really the overlap both causes conflict and suggests the importance of cooperation. Next slide. Areas of disagreement, I go through these in the book fairly more or less systematically. National identity, I think, is really critical. A lot of the book is about it. Kashmir, obviously, is a disagreement left over from the Raj. We can blame Sir Michael here for that. Nuclear and military doctrines are growing in incompatible ways. And if you follow the literature on nuclear doctrine, the Pakistani reaction to this mythical Indian cold start reaction could lead to an Indian reaction to this mythical Pakistani policy, which you could get a series of interactions between the two militaries, which do wind up at a point where there could be a crisis. There's other specific territories, so doctrine itself is an issue. A couple of people do interesting work on this. There are other territorial disputes, Siachen, Glacier. I've changed my mind on that considerably. I was the guy who called it two bald men fighting over a cone, which I actually stole from the Brits about
Falklands.
Yeah. So I used that one day and said it was attributed to me, but actually it was a British characterization of the Falklands. But I do think that from an Indian military point of view, which is why they talk about Siachen more than they should, and they publicly said they would oppose any change in policy on Siachen, that they see the connection between China and Pakistan up there to the north of Siachen. For them, that's a strategic issue. In my own view, it's changed on that. If they see it as strategic, then it is strategic, at least for them. Sear Creek and so forth. There's some cursory discussion of Sear Creek and a few other little things in there. Water and energy. And of course, we had Brahma Chelani through Washington talking about water and war. I think a slightly exaggerated analysis of it, in fact, considerably exaggerated analysis, but these are areas of enormous possibility for cooperation. And I took a look at the Indus Basin Treaty and how it was brought about, and I'm not sure whether that can be replicated, but it is critical. And of course, at the top of this, it sits China. And the relationship with Pakistan and China on waters would be very interesting if we could find out what the Pakistanis are asking the Chinese, because the water comes from China through India to Pakistan. And I don't know, but I think it's a critical issue on that. And then finally, the so-called trust deficit. A friend of mine, Mahmoud Durrani, wrote a really important piece. Said there's a trust deficit between India and Pakistan. That became Pakistani dogma or mantra for a long time. Mantra is the wrong word for Pakistan. But I said, no, it's not a trust deficit. It's a verification deficit. I happened to work for President Reagan, against my will perhaps, or not wholeheartedly, but I did work for George Bush. And Reagan did say, trust but verify. And when he said that, I immediately had to translate into Urdu and Hindi, and also Persian and Hebrew and whatever else languages are relevant, because there's a verification deficit. The governments cannot trust their own intelligence agencies to tell them what's going on. That's the problem. And I've been briefed by Pakistan Army officers, Anatol probably has also for years now, and the figure was 27 Indian consulates, each pumping out spies coming over to Pakistan in Afghanistan, and then it came down to 25 and 24, and then it settled around 7 or 8. Chris Fair, who's visited some of them, said it's all myth, so in a sense, the Pakistan Army believed what their own intelligence services told them. They should, of course, but did their intelligence services know what was going on? Well, there's a verification deficit, and there's a verification deficit on the Indian side. And if you talk to former intelligence officials in both countries, you can see that it's a real problem, big issue. That's one of my favorite bloggers is B. Raman, former number 2 of RAW, who's really very good. Raman after going through life-threatening illness, his stuff is very good. And he's taken a sensible position on normalization with Pakistan. So there's a trust deficit, which is a verification deficit. They can't trust each other. Sometimes they trust the Americans, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we wind up, and the Brits also, in a position where both sides are looking to us for information. And we may not know. I went through the brass tacks crisis in the State Department. We had no idea what was going on. But we told both sides not to worry. It's all okay, no problem. When I did a book on this and interviewed some of the people on the Indian side, it was clear that the Indians had a plan to destroy Pakistan. No doubt about it. It was just called off at the last minute. And so, can you trust the Americans to tell the truth? And I think both sides are becoming aware of this. The next slide. Oh, that slide. I just missed seeing them in Washington. I forgot their name. Bopama and two Indian and Pakistani. Quraishi. And the T-shirts are "Make tennis not war." I can't read it. Make tennis not war. I tried to get the T-shirt. They were together selling the T-shirts online. They broke up, and Bopama just bombed out in Melbourne. So the team is broken up. So that was one of the big chances for India-Pakistan cooperation. There's a lot of examples of this in sports. The lady tennis player married a Pakistani. She had trouble. And of course, the cricket team's going back and forth with the turfs being, turned up and attacked. The bottom slide is, I thought, a cute slide, so I put that in there. Okay. The book will have none of this. Go ahead. That's keep the American military awake when I brief it. 2 chapters go through systematically elite opinion on both sides. And essentially, the question I tried to keep in mind in the book, to keep it short, focused only on this. Otherwise, I tend to wander off. What do Indians think about Pakistan? And what do they think about normalization with Pakistan? And then another chapter, what do Pakistanis think about India? What do they think about normalization with India? Well, as you would expect, there's a spectrum of opinion. There's an overlap, but there's also outliers on both sides. There's a few peaceniks in India, all 4 of them. Mani and a few other, really, the late Indira Gujral, who I knew very well, who really want to normalize with Pakistan. They're really very active in doing this. But, and in Pakistan, there's quite no counterpart group. There may be covert normalization types, and to some extent the MQM has moved it from a position of being anti-Indian to being pro-Indian. So there's a spectrum of opinion, but in both sides, there's a cluster of people who are, I'd say, provisional skeptics. That is, normalization is good if the other side will demonstrate their sincerity, if they won't cheat, if they won't do this. A lot of ifs in this. And so I think, and that, out of this, of course, then there's the hardliners who say, under no circumstances do we need to normalize with the other country. In Pakistan, you get the guys who say, first Pakistan, then India, then the rest of the world. In a sense, the Islamic Revolution will have its roots in Pakistan, will then sweep over India, and Manil Suri's book is about that in part. And then after India, there's no stopping the Islamic revival. Actually, that's Al-Qaeda and Taliban philosophy. Begin with Pakistan, have the revolution in Pakistan. Then you move to India, all those Indian Muslims ripe for the taking. And then you move on, that's the base from which you attack the rest of the world, or you restore the Islamic greatness. And that, I think the Pakistan army has realized that they're the target now. They're not simply a facilitator of attacks on India. So in a sense, their views have come around considerably and changed. So I think there's a lot of debate and division within the Pakistan army about who these people are, these Pakistanis who still want global Islamic revolution. So there's the two chapters lay out a spectrum of opinion. On the Indian side, epitomized by a former head of an Indian think tank, while talking about the northern areas, he said, well, we're not going to negotiate, it's all ours, all Kashmir is ours, and we're going to, even the northern territories, which are uncertain, that's India's also. So in a sense, on both sides of these, take no prisoner view, and that a revolution is there. But there is a pragmatic middle in both countries, led by the business communities to the degree in Pakistan the military lets them do these things. I've heard different stories of how the army came around to support the trade normalization. I don't know if any of them are true, but the critical point is, the last bullet, spoilers are effective in both countries. That is, I was told by an Israeli foreign minister once, he said, if you have a basket of eggs, he told me this in India, in fact, you have a basket of eggs, and you drop a stone in them, it doesn't matter how many eggs you have. That stone's going to turn them all to omelets. So it doesn't take much to spoil a relationship. And I'm pretty much persuaded, on the basis of inference, that the Mumbai attacks were designed to break up the normalization process. I won't call it peace process, but normalization. I think that if there's another attack, and maybe Kashmir was about this, I don't know. And probably one side or the other side, or both sides, some people on both sides wanted to spoil it. And there's evidence that there's some evidence on the basis of press reports that the Indian side built this beheadings up to a point because they didn't want to see the normalization process go forward. I'm not saying that, but if you read the press, that's as good an explanation as saying that the Pakistanis did, or maybe they both agreed that they would have a crisis and stop the normalization process. In fact, the armies in both countries, elements of the military in both countries, have a common interest in not having a peace process or normalization process. Next slide. Okay, what is the normalization process? I try not to get into theory, but the book was read by a theorist, and he said he didn't bless it, but he said it's okay, let it go. Basically, two approaches, top down. You get a bunch of people sitting around a table from two different countries, and they say, we got to normalize. It's in our interest to do this for all the reasons I discussed. Let's move ahead, subtly, quietly, but let's move ahead. We'll allow those peaceniks to have their conference and so forth. And then the process accelerates over time. There have been a lot of examples of this in Europe. Very few examples outside of Europe. There's a couple of books written about the European normalization process. So you get a strategic consensus between elites. It's a top-down relationship. The other approach, of course, is bottom-up. That is, we sit around a table, we hold hands, and we sing Kumbaya. And we come to realization we're one people, one God, one or maybe several gods in some cases. One world, we live happily ever after. For the blessings of our children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the bottom up. We trade, we have track through diplomacy, we go to a lot of conferences, we talk to each other, we make friends, we drink beer afterwards, and so forth. That's the bottom up process. The lesson is that it's easy to sabotage bottom up by hot rhetoric and or violence. And there's a lot of examples of this where this normalization process is sabotaged. Or on one side, in that case, in both countries, those who want to normalize by bottom-up are attacked by the top-down people. Well, you're just a fool. You think those Hindus or those Muslims are normal. They're not like us. They're different kind of civilization. There's a real conflict between us. And they're attacked in their own country by their fellow countrymen, let alone by the other side. So you've all heard of these vigils on the border and so forth between Indians and Pakistani, kind of like vigils, and they work, but then they're also derided, and sometimes the police are not very cooperative and they're beaten up. So it's easy to sabotage bottom up by hot rhetoric or by violence. I think in the recent case, at least the interpretations I read in the newspaper, Manmohan broke off the normalization process because of the hot language coming out of the Indian press. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's a plausible explanation. Timing. It's difficult to get strategic elites in agreement at the same time. South Asia is rich in missed opportunities. Wealthy country and wealthy region and missed opportunities. That is, when the Indians have been ready, the Pakistanis aren't. When the Pakistanis seem to be ready, the Indians aren't. And this could go on for a long time. It could, and it has gone on for a long time. It's gone on for 65 years, and the book argues 35 years more. It's not that big a stretch. Next slide. Okay, why is this all happening? With some theories of the case. We got a case here. The book discusses in different places, but really, I've talked about this before. Civilizational differences, some people call it that. Power disparities, a big India can't normalize with a weak Pakistan. Therefore, a weak Pakistan tries to become larger to normalize with India. That's known as an arms race. And I think that's part of the process now. It's transferred from a conventional arms race to a nuclear arms race. The Pakistanis believe that they're so far behind in conventional weapons, they've got to get more nuclear weapons. When I was in the State Department and had to talk to Pakistanis about this, they felt that they were so far behind in conventional weapons that they threatened to go nuclear unless we gave them more conventional weapons. So they have it both ways. Either you're rich in conventional weapons, but you still need nuclear because the other side is even more conventional weapons, or vice versa. I've got to put this in the book. I haven't tried this in Washington. There's going to be a huge amount of American equipment coming out of Afghanistan. Huge amount of it. Billions and billions of dollars. Maybe we should just sell it to the Indians and the Pakistanis. I'm not sure whether that makes sense or not, but it's certainly...
Cover your costs.
Yeah, cover our costs. Just get some of them return. Because the Pakistanis will want it. They want to buy the stuff as they come across the Khyber Pass. They want to buy our tanks and armored personnel carriers and everything else. Well, maybe we should say, yes, we'll sell it to you, but of course we want to sell some to our other friend in South Asia. What? India? Are you still willing to buy them? We'll see what happens. And this time we'll get some money back. So one argument is power disparities, and of course both sides will always argue that they're behind militarily, therefore they have to accelerate either their nuclear or the conventional forces. Role of outsiders, it's easy to blame outsiders, and outsiders have had a major role in this to some degree. I won't specify who, but a certain superpower is at least partially responsible. Other former major powers are too. Pernicious bureaucracies, I took the names out. But I gave a talk in Canada a couple of years ago, and I said the two most recalcitrant bureaucracies I knew of in South Asia were the ISI and MEA in India, which did not strengthen my standing in either ISI or MEA. Yeah, they sort of took it as a joke, I think. But I think that's true, though. The ISI really is a hardline organization when it comes to India. You talk to their people, and they have this vision of India, sort of uncritical vision of India as unalterably evil and threatening. But MEA has always had a vision of Pakistan like that. It's sort of the Nehruvian vision that sooner or later Pakistan will go away. It's not a real country. And when you hear an Indian talk about, well, Pakistan is nothing, our competition is with China, that's a way of saying Pakistan doesn't count. We don't need to normalize with China, with Pakistan. I talked to some BJP people, really nameless, I quote him in the book, and one of them said to me, he said, the real strategic issue for India is how to separate Pakistan and China. By being hostile to Pakistan, we've allowed them to invite China into the subcontinent. He was all in favor of normalizing with Pakistan to get rid of the Chinese factor in South Asia and give Pakistan what they wanted, or at least symbolically what they wanted, and shore up the South Asian resistance to a Chinese incursion. And I'm not sure whether I agree with that, but it does make strategic sense. And there's a senior BJP official. Now, the book has a theory. I hate to bother you with theory, but I developed it in the India Emerging Power book. Next slide. Now, the way I look at it is that 5% of the world's conflicts are are going on for 20 years or more. This is certainly at the top of the list, along with the Arab-Israeli dispute, which began at the same time, and for the same reason. And it parallels the Arab-Israeli dispute, the dispute in Tamils versus Sinhala in Sri Lanka, where it occurred to me first. And it's elements of a civil war. I know Americans are familiar with this, with our own civil war. That is, both sides have the psychology of a threatened victim. And if you're a threatened, victimized minority, you can do almost anything. And if you're a threatened, victimized, if you have the victimization complex and you feel you're in a minority, you don't have to make, you're not required to make peace. And it's easy to understand that in the case of Pakistan, which is clearly paranoid about India. But as I've said for years now, even paranoid states have enemies. Sometimes paranoia has a basis in reality. The Indian case is more interesting, and since I wrote the India Emerging Power book, India's changed a lot, but not that much. In a sense, the Indians have a new self-confidence. They've done a couple of things right, and they've become very dismissive of Pakistan, but not so dismissive that they want to make any concessions to Pakistan. And I think the real issue is going to be, can the Indians make concessions to Pakistan, even if they're symbolic, and if they call these things different names, like Kashmir and so forth? Can they make any concessions at all to Pakistan? Or will the people say, we're going to drive Pakistan under, no question about it, no need to make any concessions? Will that school prevail? Or will they be able to veto any normalization? I think that's one of the big issues facing Indian diplomacy in the next couple of years. And really, growing Indian self-confidence change the outlook towards Pakistan and other threats as well. I'd say the same thing is true of China. Now, by taking the Americans out of the equation, in a sense, we've elevated both Pakistan and China in the Indian mind as a threat. And the issue is, do countries, not simply India, but all countries, have to have a certain quantity of threat? That if you're a great power, you have to have a great threat. I think that's true. Great powers need great threats, otherwise they're not great. And we had the Russians for a long time, and now we've got Islamic terrorism, so you need a great threat, or you magnify whatever threat you have to develop greatness. So the Indians faced with an issue of having to magnify the Pakistani threat, or is it such a serious threat, in fact, that it's surpassed only by China? I think that's what the substance of Indian foreign policy debate is about. And can they reach a point where normalization process can be sustained? I was hopeful, as in the middle of writing this, the trade agreement came through. And clearly, both sides have backed away from it to some degree. It's not always the first step or the second step, it's the third step that really is important in any negotiation. And that's why my confidence that normalization will not take place is buoyed up a little bit. Next slide. Three broad scenarios. First, normalization. We sing Kumbaya, we live happily ever after. Trade agreements, here's the whole reason for it. Siachen is really irrelevant, blah, blah, blah. But there's also important obstacles on both sides. Next slide. Secondly, a bad future for Pakistan could end this process very quickly in a very ugly way. And I won't go into the details. This book talks about them at great length, which has not endeared me to Pakistanis, or some Pakistanis. But I think that the Indian government, thinking Indians have read it and understand themselves without having read it, that Pakistan is, a failed Pakistan is not an opportunity but a threat. That is, a failed Pakistan could spew out terrorists, nuclear weapons, migrants, people migrating back to India in large numbers, and it would destabilize India. No Indian politician wants to see more Muslims add to the Indian voting rolls. It's simply already a difficult balance. So I think the big uncertainty is Pakistan's future in the next 15, 20 years. In that book we did, Future of Pakistan, my judgment was that Pakistan would be stable for another 6 or 7 years. After that, couldn't predict at all. So I think, in a sense, there's an opportunity now for India to sort of rethink its Pakistan policy. I'm not confident that it will do that. I think very skeptical that it will happen. But if India were to do this, and I've written this in the India book as well as the Pakistan book, India could make the bigger impact on Pakistan than the Americans could, clearly. India has more leverage in Pakistan if it wanted to exercise it than even the Chinese. Excellent. Third scenario, and this is the book jacket. This was a print by Sir Henry Stringer, for a manual for his officers, 1820 or 1823, just about the time Wellington's founded this college. Is that right? King's College. Yeah. Which I'm astonished to learn of you sign out the door. So it could be, I think the most likely future, it's the one I did not like personally. I really would like to see normalization, peace take place. I think continuing still the last 60 years, India-Pakistan rivalry without end, the region remaining bogged down in a series of quarrels and mini crises, occasional, mostly over Kashmir, but also dampened down by the existence of nuclear weapons. There's not much in here, these slides about nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons, Ken Waltz was right to the degree that India and Pakistan are rational. They understand that nuclear weapons can spoil your day if you use them. So both sides are exploring what we explored and the Brits explored, the French and the Russians explored, Soviets explored during the Cold War. What's the use of nuclear weapons? And Subramanian, my teacher and good friend of mine, he said they're not weapons of war, but they are used in crises. They're actually instruments of policy. So you can't win a war with them. On the other hand, if you don't have them, you could lose a war. So that's why it's a sort of tragic technology. But they do have this effect of calming people down in a crisis. In the book I did with Indian and Pakistani colleagues on 4 crises in a peace process, we saw nuclear weapons as more or less a stabilizing factor. On the other hand, if you have nuclear weapons, the more you have does not guarantee that peace is more likely, normalization is likely. You just keep on going in a state of hostility, as we did with the Soviets. The Soviets gave up because of other reasons, not because of the number of nuclear weapons. And this has implications for nuclear doctrine, nuclear strategy for both countries. But next. Now, there are a couple of chapters in here. One chapter that looks at policy. I won't go into detail. This is mostly meant for an American audience. But I think that there are 3 or 4 implications that flow from the conclusion that is likely to continue. One is complacency. It's going to be easy to assume, especially by outsiders and by Indians and Pakistanis, that because there's been no major war in the last 5 or 7 years, no major crisis, that this will go on forever. Well, these things can blow up very quickly, and where there have been cases where on both sides, serious mistakes have been made in terms of judgment or miscalculation or intelligence. Serious mistakes where they really didn't understand what was going on. And they got out of it one way or the other. And secondly, so the whole thing, we don't understand the relationship of technology and weaker central governments in India in particular, how that's going to affect the behavior. So they could trip into a crisis. So don't be complacent. Secondly, from an American point of view, at least, it'll be difficult for the U.S. to pursue a sustained normal strategic relationship with either India or Pakistan. And I've been arguing with friends in Washington, the dehyphenation policy was good in one sense, it sort of separated our India-Pakistan policies, but it didn't separate India and Pakistan. If you have good relations with 2 countries that are going to get into a crisis every 10 years or even sooner, how good is that relationship? And are they going to expect that you're going to come to their rescue in the next crisis? And I think so the dehyphenation policy doesn't answer all the questions. It really is. It leaves open a whole bunch of questions. How do you have a relationship between 2 countries that are going to go to war or be on the edge of war with each other? And finally, outsiders, this is sort of the one that gets everybody off the hook. We can offer advice, and when asked, we can, assist and help managing the relationship. But in the end, of course, it's Pakistan and India responsibility, but that's sort of pushing it back on them. But then the consequences, I think a point that outsiders have to make is that if they have another major crisis and a war, it's not going to stay in South Asia. It could spread elsewhere. I think the Chinese are very concerned about this. So in a sense, China is a potential ally in terms of the normalization process. So a couple, 3 proposals, all unpopular among somebody. First, I think we should move towards the assumption, Americans should move towards the assumption that the line of control will be the international border. Not quite the Indian position, but close to it. But it's up to India and Pakistan to reach that conclusion themselves. And I think that if America did that, it might sort of stimulate debate and conversations within South Asia. Secondly, we should regularize our nuclear relationship with Pakistan, help stabilize the deterrent relationship that exists now. We've done that with India. We have a U.S.-India nuclear deal, euphemistically about civil nuclear power, but in fact recognize India as a nuclear weapon state, although not by name. But I think we should go further and do this with Pakistan, maybe even the Israelis, in a sense, the NPT outside the NPT. That the Pakistanis accept the obligations and commitments of an NPT state. Also, a commitment not to test again. They should get whatever, they should not be punished for it. And in Washington, there was great bitterness at the U.S.-India nuclear deal. So the notion of a U.S.-Pakistan agreement of some sort is anathema to our non-proliferation ayatollahs. And I don't know whether it was Subu or myself who invented the term. We both used it. We talked about it. I think, I don't know if he got it from me or I got it from him. But it's our ayatollahs will not permit this. And I've been told by friends it won't fly in a democratic administration at all, which means another 4 years. But I think we should normally recognize Pakistan as a nuclear weapon state, not to punish them for past bad behavior, but to reward them for future good behavior. To me, that's the essence of diplomacy. And if we could verify what they're doing and keep them under control, I think it would be in our interest. Finally, I think we need to cooperate with India and other states, that's a euphemism for China, to bring about the peaceful transformation of Pakistan along more or less democratic lines. Now, it would be silly for an American to go to China and say, would you help us make Pakistan democratic? It'd actually be kind of big. They think it's a big joke. On the other hand, if you go there and say, can you help us make Pakistan a kind of country that will not be training your Uyghurs and your crazy Muslims in Pakistan, I think they'd be interested. How do we do that? How do we go? Well, you reassure them of water. And to that, you have to reassure India of water. You know, Pakistan has leverage here, and Pakistan has, Pakistan's policy with China is also help me or else. And the Chinese, I think, are increasingly sensitive to Pakistan's erratic ways. I think that covered the last one. Yeah. Okay. Here, questions, comment. This is the title of the book, and I must say that Brookings is nothing else. A great institution allows me to design my own cover. So if you see my past books, I found this in the National Army Museum here. As soon as I saw it, I said, this is the cover for my book. So the book began with the title and the cover. Then I wrote the book to match up. So any comments or questions?
Thanks, Steve. I mean, we will sort of request Anatol here to maybe make some responses to what Steve has said before we open it up for further discussion.
Just very briefly, because I agree on just about everything, including the last three recommendations, and especially when it comes to talking with China about Pakistan. And I would urge you all to get the book. I think it is a really very important and very interesting contribution to thinking of these issues. Really just a couple of footnotes. I mean, the unreliability of the two intelligence services and what they tell their people. Well, as I'm sure you all know, the Pakistani military has been putting out this line within Pakistani society about war supporting the Pakistani Taliban, something for which, of course, there is not the remotest shred of evidence. Balochistan, perhaps, but Pakistani Taliban, absolutely not. But that's not the most frightening thing for me. The most frightening thing is that as far as I can see, the overwhelming majority of Pakistani officers I've talked to actually believe this. Now that's worrying.
Sorry, believe what?
Believe that India is supporting the Pakistani Taliban. On the other side, I mean, not perhaps at the same level or to the same extent, but I have talked to senior Indians who are quite convinced that China is developing a military role in Gwadar, something which is simply not true so far. There is no military role. What could happen in future, what Chinese contingency plans may be, I don't know. But there is no military presence, and not even in the most embryonic sense at present. So yes, I mean, there is very considerable problem with both paranoia and misinformation on both sides. The international and historical context, I mean, the comparison with the Cold War, I think, has two disturbing aspects as far as India and Pakistan are concerned, and one possibly more optimistic lesson. Compared to the Cold War between nuclear powers in Europe, which of course never, thank God, turned into a hot war in Europe, though it did elsewhere, of course, the really frightening thing is the element of volatility introduced by the presence of terrorists, which was not a major issue in Europe during the Cold War. And I entirely agree with your analysis, and of course it's only our impression, but that the Mumbai attacks were probably intended to wreck reconciliation. Then there is another element which could, pray God it doesn't, but along the lines of some conflicts outside Europe in the Cold War, contribute to making the relationship even worse, and that is future developments in Afghanistan. If India finds itself drawn more and more into one side in Afghanistan while Pakistan is aligned with the other. I mean, let us hope that can be excluded. It was an Indian general who said to me that you didn't have to be a historical genius to see that for an external power becoming involved in the affairs of Afghanistan doesn't usually turn out well, was his phrase. He also, however, admitted that by no means all of his colleagues would agree with him on that. I just reviewed William Dalrymple's book on the British experience of 1839 to 42. What was Hirohito's phrase in 1945? It didn't turn out altogether to our advantage. It does seem to me that on the whole, the lessons of history suggest that keeping out of Afghanistan is a good idea. It would certainly be a tragedy if India and Pakistan not merely contributed to the further destabilisation and an increase of civil war in Afghanistan, but if this then had the reciprocal effect, which it might well, of making their own relations much worse. There is one thing, though, from the Cold War which I always try to remind people of, and just possibly, in the MFN is a first stepping stone towards this. But what is still by far the biggest complex of energy infrastructure in the world, the gas pipeline network from Russian Siberia to Western Europe, was constructed not merely during the Cold War, but it went on being constructed during one of the lowest points of the Cold War, which was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So just possibly sort of iron economic imperatives could perhaps lead to that kind of development, even while the formal standoff, the categorical dispute over Kashmir remains. However, I have a nasty feeling that for that to happen, the global energy situation, or at least the energy situation relating to the Persian Gulf and India's supplies, would have to become a great deal worse before, for example, India would commit itself to an energy pipeline across Pakistan from Iran. But I just wanted to raise that. China, and also the talk was billed as having something about if this goes on for another 100 years. It was very
only 35.
Only 35, exactly. And of course it has gone on for, as you say, 65 already. What your BJP people said about China was extremely interesting. Because China, I think, now does have this dual potential role in the region. On the one hand, it's very striking, and so I have been told by Chinese, by Pakistanis, by Westerners who've observed this closely, that it does seem that all China's influence on Pakistan in recent years has been in the direction of caution, of not stirring the pot. China, of course, has no love for Islamist terrorists and extremists, but it also, it appears, really has no desire for a regional crisis in South Asia. And that does provide, I think, in principle, a very good basis for what you said, Steve, about the need to talk to China, about strong common interests in stabilising Pakistan and developing Pakistan in ways that it doesn't collapse internally. Yes, keep talking to India about the fact that, as of course sensible Indians, and especially businessmen, know very well, the collapse of Pakistan would be a catastrophe for India. The effects on international business confidence, the possibility of flows of refugees, the nightmare scenario of areas of Pakistan actually become failed states along Somali lines and havens for terrorism, and so forth and so on. However, there is another aspect to China, which is, I fear, becoming more and more alarming, and there's almost a headline every day now which brings that out. The latest one has been about this Chinese ship allegedly locking its radar onto a Japanese vessel in the region of these damned islands. And I do find a really striking difference here between what remains in South Asia as elsewhere, China's strategy of peaceful rise, of not stirring pots, of not getting into clashes with the Americans, of not trying to replace the Americans as hegemon, and the astonishing contrast between China's rhetoric and, to an extent, behaviour in East Asia over these islands, where, as far as I can see, I mean, not, it must be said, without help from some extremely unwise Japanese policies, but still, China has, in the course of the past year, to a degree, torn up 30 years of patient diplomacy in the region. I fear that because, above all, this is an issue where Chinese nationalism is involved. And not merely, therefore, does this stir up sentiments in the Chinese masses, perhaps even genuine sentiments in the Chinese elites as well. But, of course, it also brings into play the factor, above all, on which China has founded its domestic legitimacy over the past 2 generations. Economic growth, yes, but also nationalism as a replacement for communism. Now, it is perhaps alarmist in these circumstances to raise the spectre of August 1914, but I think it's as alarmist as it might have appeared a year ago. And then, of course, there is the question of whether India and Pakistan could avoid being sucked into an East Asian conflict if it were drastically to worsen, God forbid. Here, the statement last month, no, it's December now, by the chief of the Indian Naval Staff, Admiral Joshi, about India being prepared to deploy naval forces in the South China Sea necessary to defend its economic and maritime interests in the region, is extremely provocative as far as the Chinese are concerned. And of course, if God forbid ever implemented, would virtually invite a much harsher and stronger Chinese. And would also, one would have thought at a stroke, wipe out China's role as a restraining force on Pakistan, and in fact flip it around completely. So the element of Indian rivalry with China, American calculations as far as this is concerned, could potentially draw India and Pakistan into a truly catastrophic conflict. And yes, I mean, 65 years have already gone, 35 years into the future, I don't know. 100 years ago, of course, if one goes back 100 years, we were indeed in 1913. Franz Joseph was on the throne of Austria, Nicholas II was on the throne of Russia, and George V was on the throne of India, amongst a great many other places, King Emperor. An awful lot can happen in 100 years. But I certainly would say that it is, just as it is strongly in China's interest to restrain any potential crisis in South Asia, I would say that it is actually, whatever one may hear in Washington and elsewhere, strongly in South Asia's interest not to become involved in East Asian disputes. The question of who owns these islands in East Asia is of much the same importance, I think, to India as the question of who ruled Bosnia was to Britain in August 1914. Best to keep out of it. Also for the future, yes, and in those circumstances, the risk of small countries with exaggerated paranoias, as you say, Steve, some genuine grounds for them, but blown up into almost sort of articles of national faith and national culture. On the other hand, great powers who, of course, are comparing themselves not just with their immediate neighbours, but with other countries of whom they are perhaps genuinely fearful, but perhaps also exaggeratedly fearful. This does have certain echoes of the whole European scene before 1914. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing, if one's looking into the further future, here perhaps one's talking 35 years, maybe, certainly 100 years, is of course the long-term effects. Well, actually, of potential effects of water issues, which you touched upon, even before you factor in the potential and as yet unproven effects of climate change. One of the striking things about the World Bank's report of 2004 on water in Pakistan is that that was a profoundly worrying document. But what it said was, all of these potentially disastrous effects come in only if you draw existing lines into the future without factoring in the unknown effects of climate change. And once again, I mean, if that does for Pakistan, however long down the line, decades, India, in my view, will be catastrophically affected as well, both because India will suffer directly, but also it is very difficult to imagine India in its present form surviving the collapse of Pakistan, which, by the way, would almost certainly find its echo in the collapse of Bangladesh on the other side of the continent. And that, I think, sort of brings me to my final point. Sorry, if I have 1914 my mind, it's partly because I went to a talk by my brother, who's a great historian of Imperial Russia and of the European empires in general, a couple of days ago. And he was describing the characters, the institutions, and the assumptions and the analyses of the great powers in Europe in July 1914. And he brought out how rational they all were. They were all, in different ways, very sensible when they were making calculations about their national power, about future threats, about what could happen to them a few years down the line if they didn't fight now. Leaving aside the Serbs, perhaps, but the Austrians were quite sensible, the Russians were quite sensible, the Germans were quite sensible, the British were very sensible, naturally, as we all know. French, I won't say. They were all entirely rational in their calculations, and they were all absolutely bloody crazy in view of what turned out to be the real threats facing their societies. So, I think, on one hand, Steve, I entirely agree with you, the most probable scenario is drawing this line into the future. At the same time, I also think it's always worth pointing out that 200 years from now, people may look back and say, bloody mad.
Thanks, Anatol. Steve, shall we just open up for further questions, and then you could possibly leave in some of your responses?
Let me just, one quick response. Sure. One of the policy points I didn't put up on the board because it seems so futile is that America should have not had this policy it pursued in Afghanistan. And had we gone to a regional settlement to begin with, India, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, and the U.S. all agreeing to have sort of a neutral Afghanistan. But one of the problems with that, not only was it India, Pakistan couldn't agree, because they just fought a proxy war between themselves, but we and the Iranians couldn't agree, the Americans and the Iranians, so I think that was dead on arrival. But I think it's still valid, and to get India, Pakistan, because India and Pakistan inherited the same Raj tradition, and that's one of the basic arguments of the book. They inherited all the choke points for South Asia, and now they're fighting over them. So that's one of the great ironies of the relationship is that they have a common interest in protecting the region from external intervention, yet they seem to be unable to act together because they're busy fighting each other.
Right, we'll open up for questions, so just draw my attention in case you want to. So, shall we start?
Yeah, Michael Alpha, just 4 very quick one-liners. First, on water, I agree with both of you. I think there's a real huge thing looming over both countries. But the Indus Water Treaty actually has been not a bad bit of architecture through previous crises. On your final conclusions, Steve, 3 of them, the one about bringing China, making China part of the solution, not part of the problem, has to be right. And I agree we've got to get India to pursue that. On your second one about recognising Pakistan as a nuclear weapon state, I'm afraid I'm still an Anatol on that. Not because of the Pakistan logic, your logic is absolutely right, but because of the implications of moral hazard and NPT in Iran and all the rest beyond that. At the end of the NPT regime, if we do that, So I would be pretty cautious about going down there. But my main point is your three scenarios for the future, which I think you've rightly concluded 35 more years of the same. But is there a sort of part B to that, which is that Pakistan doesn't fail completely, but continues to get worse and weaker, not least economically, and that India gradually gets its act together economically and gets even more powerful in comparison to Pakistan now. And so you've already got a 10-to-1 ratio, but let's say that becomes a 20-to-1 ratio. Does there not come a point in time when Pakistan hasn't failed to the extent of terrorism and nuclear war, your second scenario, but just needs to hitch itself somehow to that Indian engine because, for economic reasons, it's fallen so far behind?
That would be normalization, and that could happen.
Well, that's not as good as your happy picture number one. It's not going to happen.
But you've got to persuade the guys in uniform to do that.
Yeah.
It comes down to the army people, and while they've rethought their role and they've rethought their problems, has it made that big? Actually, I just reviewed 3 separate books about the Pakistan Army. I've written a read for 3 of them, and 2 of them are coming out. The 3rd will come out, and nobody really knows. I mean, nobody's been in the army. No foreigner has been in the army to talk to them. I visit them occasionally. We're going to have the deputy director of ISI at Brookings next week, but it's not quite the same as actually being there. So we don't really know what their views are, and whether even if an army chief, say Kiani, might be Kiani, said, okay, we're going to change our direction, we're going to normalize with India, but we need something from the Indians. Could he bring his army with him, and would the Indians provide that reciprocal? That's the process that doesn't take place. It's like Thomas and Sinhala. You need it just doesn't work. Both sides feel that they're threatened and vulnerable, especially on the Pakistan side.
But India can afford to send it back on Pakistan and just carry on growing.
It could, but then it runs the risk of chaos in Pakistan. And some Indians say we can withstand a couple of million people coming over the border. We can withstand terror attacks. We could withstand a nuclear attack or 2. You begin to wonder how much they could withstand. Nuclear weapons are different. They're not just a pain they could destroy New Delhi. And Indians are not really fully conscious of the consequences of that aspect.
They're getting better, but they were.
And that's Pakistan's greatest asset. Help me or else. We'll blow us all up. That's the ultimate suicide bomb. Yeah.
Sorry.
If I understood you right, you said that Pakistan's future, is uncertain. There's a real risk of collapse. Now, Pakistan feels threatened by India. Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons to kind of redress the imbalance up to a point, and therefore provide a measure of deterrence. Yet, it was in the 90s that it chose to use terrorist groups as an instrument of policy against India primarily, and even now it justified in those terms. Now, it seems to me that with the development of Pakistani Taliban and what's been happening in Karachi over the last 20 years, this is turning out to be counterproductive for Pakistan's internal security and therefore stability. What do you think the military in Pakistan, since they are the power brokers, think about this and their future? And if you linked up with the other point you made earlier, that India can have a lot of leverage with Pakistan, what sort of leverage does India have, and how can these things be turned around?
Read the book. These are critical questions, and I take a whole book to discuss them, Frank. This is a summary. But you're right that a lot of what Chairman Mao has the great phrase for this. Chairman Mao said he picked up a boulder only to drop it on his own feet. A lot of Pakistan's problems are self-committed. They blow back from what they did in the past. So the Indian view is, okay, they're destroying themselves. It's not our problem. It's somebody else. It's the American problem. They love to see us worry about Pakistan. But can they bring themselves to do anything to rescue Pakistan? Even if they wanted to, could Pakistan be rescued?
Can they rescue?
The book I wrote on the future of Pakistan has this central question. I think for the next 6 or 7 years, I can't predict beyond that. But there's a lot of Pakistanis who are voting with their feet, who are leaving the country, or sending their children overseas. And they think that maybe it can't be rescued, but a lot of really good Pakistanis left, so I'm not going to draw any conclusions on that. I think from a policy point of view, you have to work for the best, even if you're a little concerned about what's going to happen. So at least from an American point of view, I think from an Indian point of view also, try to do what we can to stabilize Pakistan. If the Pakistanis can't stabilize themselves, then prepare for the worst. And the worst could be awful. But on the other hand, it could go down with a whimper, sort of the way the Soviets did. And there's a lot of discussion in the book about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was in Russia by chance about that time. It was total anarchy. Nobody knew where anything was. Now, if there's anarchy in Pakistan, people running in and out of airports without any police or any control, would there be anarchy in the Pakistani nuclear weapons program? Were there any Russian generals who wanted to grab a few nukes and take them off and run someplace else? That would be their retirement plan. Are there Pakistani generals who'd want to do the same with their nukes? And they've got 100 nuclear weapons now, not just one or two. So I think that the problem of the nuclear weapons sets Pakistan in a different category than any other failed state, except the former Soviet Union. And it's more, to me, the analogy, Anatol, is Russia under the Tsars, the last years of the Tsars, when the Tsarist Russia came apart under pressure of the war with Germany. And we have these reports unconfirmed of attacks on several Pakistani military facilities where there are nuclear weapons. And some of those reports indicate that there were inside jobs as well as outsiders. If things get worse in Pakistan, will this be more likely to happen? I would not want to be living in New Delhi at that time. In other words, it's a low probability but high risk. And that's why it's important. And that's why I think it's not going to disappear.
I also wouldn't want to be the US president who would have to make a decision about what to do at that.
See, and one of the ironies is that the Pakistanis assume that we can, and the Indians assume this also. Subbu said to me, he said, Steve, you take care of the nukes, we'll take care of their army. And I said, lots of luck, it took us a couple of years to find Osama, one guy, and kill him. How could we find 100 nuclear weapons, maybe in 25 different dumps around Pakistan, moving on vehicles around? And the more you move them, the more risk there is of being attacked and taken off by bad guys. So it's a frightening scenario. Iran would like to be Pakistan. Yeah, Americans spend all the time worrying about Iran, but Pakistan, I think, is a far more dangerous country than Iran. We know Pakistan has up to 100 nuclear weapons.
Yep. Just please also introduce yourself so we know who you are.
And I'm currently at London University. Very interesting talk, first of all, and because you mentioned the normalization process that the media plays a kind of bad role in both the countries. I just looked in.
Oh, so the
media, electronic.
Yeah. There's a faint.
It's a kind of bad role. This is kind of the jingoistic narratives, which is actually given by both the kind of private media, private television channels on both the sides, are usually not under the government's control on both the sides. So, because these are private channels, and any kind of anti-Indian, anti-Pakistani story sells. And we saw that particular thing, this in a kind of very recent example that this kind of LOC tension between India and Pakistan when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh gave a kind of a statement. But the Pakistani television channels were at that time giving kind of blanket coverage to the Qadri Sarkar, rather than talking about the kind of a very jingoistic kind of narratives coming from the Indian television channels. So my point is that basically the Pakistani, that wasn't the story which was selling at that time, but the Pakistani channels were covering it. I was wondering, because the kind of normalization process, because since both the countries have, the populations in both the countries, the electronic media, particularly these private television channels, actually have pervasive influence on both the sides, especially vis-a-vis narratives, how narratives are created across the border. I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, the deeper Aristotelian principle is no good deed goes unpunished. And we're all happy that India and Pakistan, especially now Pakistan, have free media. But in Pakistan, it's like, there are 80 channels, 80 Fox News channels. Mm-hmm. It's just incredible. And they're driven by profit and by viewership. It's not a news value, it's a commercial value. And so they don't really care what they say. They want to be provocative. So I'm pestered by both countries' media to make statements, and they're really looking for a headline. So I think that the deeper principle still is that in both countries, even India, the political system at the center is weaker. And in India, power is going to the states quickly. And the Congress Party, when I first went to India, Congress did everything all over the country. It can barely do anything in New Delhi, let alone, it can't even in the state of Delhi itself can't do anything. It's just really weak. And then, so it has less and less control over events. And in foreign policy, we discovered during the nuclear deal thing, the opposition can block something if they wants to. So New Delhi isn't as strong as it used to be in foreign policy matters. In Pakistan, while you have the army sort of supreme, the army pursues one policy and civilians pursue another policy. And I think this civilian government in Pakistan would love to normalize with India. I've talked to many of them; they really would, but the army is very skeptical. And in India, the army is skeptical on particular issues, and I think they're capable now of sabotaging a normalization process. So, and they both use the media enormously, and you get to see retired intelligence chiefs on Indian TV all the time. So it's democracy has its problems, and I'm not saying we should do away with democracy, but it creates real problems. That's why I'm skeptical about the normalization process not being blown up as it moves down the road. And I think the way the media have attacked. Now, on the other hand, there's always another hand. Two-handed professor. There's South Asia Free Media Association. There's a big discussion of that about really marvelous people in both countries. Brave journalists are going back and forth, having a long dialogue, and really, that's a classic track 2 dialogue, classic people-people dialogue. And they're really good, and as they get reported in both countries, I think improves the knowledge level in both countries. But you compare, it's become very complicated, a rich and complicated process. To speak of this reaching a conclusion anytime soon, I think I'd like to see it, but. I ran a discussion group for younger South Asian academics and journalists, 22 to 32. We met for about 10 years till the foundation decided it wasn't worth it. We bring them together for 2 weeks in India, Pakistan, or China. There were Chinese involved also to talk about these issues. The only time where it broke up, literally, was when we talked about Kashmir and made it part of the program, which was against my judgment. Otherwise, they talked about Kashmir in the dorms privately, but as soon as we made it public, they had to take positions and oppose each other, with the Chinese in the middle baffled by the whole debate between the Indians and Pakistan. So, these things have to go very carefully. What the book is very, very tough on, I was trying to be my cynical best, is the high-level track 2 dialogues, meetings of the formers. And I showed it to an Indian friend of mine who's been part of it. He said, good, he liked it. Because these are basically foundation guilt money, or American guilt money, trying to buy good conscience by bringing ex-officials together to talk about what should be done in the future by others. When they were in power, they did nothing. Now that they're out of power, they urge others to do things. So it's really a huge waste of money, a fantastic waste of money. And I keep on telling the foundations, it's a squandering. So I'm not optimistic about the track 2 dialogues or the people-to-people stuff. On the other hand, I support them. I think that they mean well, but too long an answer. So,
2 points perhaps, questions or points. But one is coming to this question about, say, political strength in India, centralization. Could it turn the argument around, Steve? I mean, I'm sure there's enough evidence to suggest that actually it is the political centralized. The fact that India has a centralized political system when it comes to foreign policy, especially in Pakistan, that we're actually beginning to see a degree of normalization. I mean, you take the US and India, that was, I think, an exceptional case. In any case, in the last 65 years, that was a case like none other. And the fact that the party actually got the deal through perhaps speaks to the fact that the party is still quite strong. The center is still quite strong. When it comes to Pakistan, for instance, I'm surprised in fact that you're saying that it is politically weak, because whether it was, Mumbai was an incredible case. 160-odd people killed in Bombay, but it was a case where the political message was clear from the very start. And this was despite media channels, despite civil society, etc. You even had Javed Akhtar on the street saying, let's go to war against Pakistan. But you had a centralized political system, especially a prime minister. So I'm just trying to say is that I don't quite understand the point about foreign policy.
Well, in the future, will we have a prime minister as restrained and as committed to normalization as Manmohan Singh?
But even if we look at it historically, right? I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that your book's trying to do is cater to a policy audience. So hence, I mean, if you look at it historically, for instance, is there a case of an Indian government in the past sort of 30 years where on the case of Pakistan, you will see that the central control has been in fact influenced to a large extent by fringe elements of domestic opposition groups? I can't find a case in my mind.
I think that may be changing. In a sense, Indian foreign policies always had a regional influence. The Southerners care more about Tamil Nadu, the Northerners care about Pakistan. So to the degree that it's a Gujarat, UP, it's very critical of normalization with Pakistan. Although some Tamil Brahmins are also critical of normalization. So the book analyzes the regional spread in India and how that might influence the central policy. And in other areas, say East Pakistan, Bangladesh policy, clearly Bengal and a big influence. It's still going to be dominated by the Indian Foreign Service, the Foreign Ministry. There's no doubt about that. But do they have imaginative, creative ideas about the future? I think you'd have to look pretty long and hard to get them. Generally, they've been the hardliners themselves. And it's been regional chief ministers that want to trade with Pakistan, except for Modi. Most of them do. The guest chief minister of Bihar went to Pakistan. He said, Bihar is your role model. I never thought I'd hear that from a Bihar chief minister. It was astonishing because, all the Bihari jokes, Bihar in Japan. Well, Bihar has actually done something for itself. And the chief minister said, we can do this we should be your role model. Actually, the worst role models of Bihar. But Modi's very hard. Modi's been non-committal as far as I can tell about this. He's not said anything except the usual stuff. Maybe when he's prime minister, if he's prime minister, he'll be very careful. But essentially, you'd have to bring him along anyways. So you're right in that the Indian system is dominated by the center in foreign policy. But economic interests are pushing for trade and normalization. And so that'll be an interesting battle to watch over the years.
I could just add just one more point. I mean, on the Kashmir, it's quite interesting. If I just give a historical case. And the case about the MEA itself is interesting. I'm not as skeptical about the MEA, perhaps, as you are. If you look at in 63, for instance, it was officers within the MEA, in fact, that was willing to provide Pakistan with the largest concessions when it came to the border. Right? Much more than the LOC, etc. But it was not the political elite, it was bureaucrats who were pushing for concessions. Because they saw what they felt with the larger picture. And comes my last point on the LOC. It's quite interesting that you say that the American position is to convert the LOC into an international boundary.
No, that's not it. It's my position.
That's your position?
I think that in the Ministry of External Affairs, both serving and retired, there's a wide range of opinion. And I think there's a younger generation coming along, which is really more, they're not pathologically anti-American. I think they're more Indian in that sense. And I've had some interesting conversations with some of them. And one senior officer said to me, he said, if we could get our officers to talk to their officers, we'd like it. They, in fact, proposed NDU to NDU exchange, and the Pakistanis turned it down. That's what happens all the time. Indians are willing to make proposals, and the Pakistanis say no, and vice versa. So you can't get them talking the same thing, saying the same thing at the same time. How do you do that? The Americans come in and say, this is how you do it. We're the wrong country. That's a tragedy of the situation. I agree, MEA has made proposals, a lot of proposals which seem reasonable and sensible. When the Pakistanis begin to accept them, MEA backs away. I remember I had a conversation with Zia once. He said, well, we've proposed joint defense with them. Yeah, I'll make sure I get it right. And they said, well, what about no war, which is what the Indians proposed to Pakistan. He said, well, the Indians have proposed this. I said, good, then you propose it back to them. He did, and they turned it down. It's like two kids chasing each other around a bush. One stops, and they go the other way. They're brilliant at doing this, especially the Pakistan Foreign Ministry and the Indian Foreign Ministry, at discovering flaws in a proposal that they've agreed to in the past and turning it back on the other side. That's what these guys, they've spent their whole careers doing this. And that's why meetings of formers is so fruitless. These guys have been spending their whole lives trying to tear down the other side. I'm more confident of a younger generation of Indians did one. I've met some really good ones. But again, you see the Indian Army emerging from nowheres about Siachen. And are they going to put pressure on a weak prime minister, perhaps? I don't know. I mean, a lot of it depends on the integrity of the prime minister, his willingness to stand up to his own bureaucracy. whether the bureaucracy finds opportunity or not. And of course, reciprocal on the other side. So,
I mean, if I may just ask a sort of quick follow-on question. Right? I mean, your sort of policy proposal one, that the LOC be sort of recognized as the international border, is in effect the Indian position for the last 65 years.
Yeah.
64 years at least. First advanced by Jawaharlal Nehru in 1948.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think the Pakistanis are going by the proposal? I mean, what have they fought for the last 65 years, if that is where their point is?
Because the second proposal is to recognize them as a nuclear weapons state. There's something in it for them. There's a lot of, the last chapter has a lot of policy proposals, but I thought these two make a nice pair. Do something for the Indians and then something for the Pakistanis. And the Indians can't object to us doing to Pakistan what we've done for them.
No, but if that proposal were indeed accepted by Pakistan, then the Kashmir dispute is for all practical purposes over, right? And then what is Pakistan going to do with the nuclear weapons center?
They've got
on the army and. In a sense, I mean, that seems to me to be the nub of the problem. I mean, Indians would be delighted if the United States could convince Pakistan to come around.
In the first book I wrote about Pakistan in 1985 on the Pakistan Army, I said, if there's normalization between India and Pakistan, we've got to find a useful role for the Pakistan Army. It can't simply have India as its only role life. So UN peacekeeping, joint operations with India and Afghanistan, perhaps. You know, there are a lot of things that Pakistan Army could do. Find them something useful to do. And, chances of this happening. But I think I paired the two proposals, LOC and nuclear normalization, together because it's something in it for each of them. Then you bring in other countries. There's a lot of other stuff in there also on Afghanistan. But if America said, even the publication of my book is going to stir the debate in Pakistan. See, America is tending towards LOC. Well, that's going to force the Pakistanis to do some serious thinking. Is the reversion of Kashmir feasible in the next 50 years or not, or so? You know, I've never met a Pakistani who thought it was. They all agree that the LOC is going to be the final, except for a few fanatics, but they all agree. So maybe if somebody says, you know, the LOC is it, and we're going to have to live with it, and the Indians will have to do it in such a way that Pakistani grievances, which are legitimate about abuses in Kashmir, are addressed, and that's part of the proposal. India has to be more forthright as to what it's doing in its own Kashmir. And of course, Kashmir is no great wonderland of civil liberties either, since both Kashmirs have their problems. So in a sense, that's I think the American government should come out and say something like this. That's my argument.
And there is, as so often been said, the Northern Irish Peace Agreement, you know, as in some ways a model or precedent for that. That did, of course, require two things. One was a lot of face-saving for the IRA and the South. But the second was, I think, in my view, much more importantly, some very concrete steps within Northern Ireland about governance, power sharing, and above all, police reform, control of the police, and demilitarisation.
Yeah, that's why I've argued for a number of years. If you begin with Kashmir, you're never going to go anywhere. Kashmir should be the kind of thing that's dealt with after 2 or 3 major agreements, and it should be dealt with by the two countries privately, quietly, with Kashmiris. But, you know, America should be nowhere near it, especially the United States, should be nowhere near it. Because it generates anger and old positions. And in a sense, you've got to come to Kashmir from a new perspective. I hope the book stirs up a debate in both countries about the LOC, especially Pakistan, because they've got to face up to the fact that if they try to seize Kashmir by force, they're going to become a radioactive pile. So we'll end it. You know, it's just not in a nuclear era. It's like seizing Berlin. You just can't do it.
Yeah, just then brings me on to your second proposal, right? I mean, in what sense do you think normalization of US-Pakistan nuclear relations can actually help stabilize deterrence in South Asia? I mean, I don't see the connection between the two things, right? I mean, in a sense, especially since you yourself are saying that Pakistan has possibly today, and actually most likely today, a larger nuclear arsenal than India has. I mean, India has not used the US in civilian nuclear deal in order to jack up the number of nuclear weapons it has. It is Pakistan which has been doing it. So how is this sort of arrangement really going to work? I mean, it seems to me to be sort of more or less cutting the leg off the stool rather than propping it up.
Yeah, Pakistanis have to engage in a debate about the purpose of nuclear weapons, that these are not really effective militarily. But when India builds anti-missile systems, all of a sudden the Pakistanis think they've got to build more. You know, there's an arms race between the two. The Indian ABM system accelerates the Pakistani nuclear program. And in a sense, that's where America can play a role. In a sense, We're not part of the Pakistani debate about their nuclear weapons program because they think we want to break it, steal it. So once we accept it and acknowledge it, that debate begins. The debate then begins with the Indians and Pakistanis. I think that it has to involve the Chinese also. All three countries have to decide. The issue is, I've lectured to the National Defense University in both countries about this. How many, to Pakistanis, I'd say, how many Indians do you have to, how many tens of millions of Indians do you have to kill to feel secure? To the Indians, I've said, how many tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Pakistanis do you have to kill to feel secure? In other words, what's your death? It's not how many weapons you have, it's how many dead Pakistanis or Indians are. How does that make you feel good, make you feel secure? And if you put it in those terms, all of a sudden nuclear weapons, I think, have a proper perspective. That they don't lead anywhere except imagining Armageddon in South Asia. This is what we went through with the Soviets. And you begin to work around these issues and, in a sense, put the nuclear programs aside, cap them in some reasonable way, and get on with other business. Because if they become the focus of the relationship, that's a way of diverting two countries from the proper dialogue, which should be about water, should be about energy, should be about trade, and so forth.
But the other point, of course, about recognizing Pakistan as a nuclear weapons state is that it is a nuclear weapons state. It's a recognition of a reality that will not go away. So, that gets a non-proliferation community upset because there's a treaty.
It's proliferation.
A treaty through which America has driven first a train in one case and then a bus in another. So,
sure. Yep.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, is there a growth in a largely Indian cultural hegemony? And what effect does this have on the Pakistani society at large and what you call the normalization process?
What was your first sentence?
Is there a growth in a largely Indian cultural hegemony in Pakistani society at large? What I mean is the consumption of, say, Hollywood movies or that kind of cultural hegemony of the Indian society. What effect does this have on the normalization process that you refer to?
Yeah. Well, the book has a definition of normalization, which is that they're not shooting at each other and they're not preparing to shoot at each other, that they might trade a little bit. That's about it. I mean, my standards are very low.
Aren't we there already?
They're until the next crisis, but as soon as you develop trade and investment, then, and this is the logic of these processes, if you have a strategic understanding, then these other things grow, and that makes it harder to change strategy. And that's the argument. How would India be a regional hegemon? We're using a Greek word popularized by the Chinese to talk about India-Pakistan relations. I don't want to go down that road. I think they have to define their own relationship in their own way that they're comfortable with, and not use the Chinese. The Chinese are the ones who popularized hegemon. Now, does it mean that Indians can tell Pakistanis what to do and what not to do? Obviously not. Does it mean that India would consult with Pakistan on important things like water? Yes, because it affects Pakistan. Does Pakistan have leverage over India? Yes. In a sense, they're reciprocal dependencies. And they've got to acknowledge that and use those dependencies to move towards normalization in as many areas as possible. But I'm not optimistic that...
Is there room for popular culture? Let's say
popular culture.
Yeah. Penetrating Pakistani society, Pakistani mind for that. Is there room for that?
Let me add a supplementary there. You look at that with the Arab Spring and the social networking, which is an amazing phenomenon. Do you see something like that picking up?
Yeah, it's happening, and talk to me in 5 years and I'll tell you whether it's working or not. But it's happening, but I'm thinking in terms of decades and how fast it's going to make a difference. Now, the social networking can be used by people who want to accelerate hatred and promote hatred. The Al-Qaeda and others are very good at it. And the book on City of Davie is great on this, a marvelous way in which social networking is used by the Kakis and the Shiv Sena and others. So the technology is neutral. The fact that people can talk to each other more easily actually weakens governments. That's one of the points I've made since 1990. Governments are weaker because they don't control the dialogue among their own citizens. Other people do. Now that's good, and it's good also in a sense. People have access to more information. As an academic, I like it. But on the other hand, that more information can be all kinds of crazy things that come in from other countries. And every Indian propagandist reads carefully every Pakistani propagandist every morning when they wake up, and vice versa. These guys follow each other very closely. So it's the extremes talking to each other and building the other up to an enormous. That's one of the negative consequences of the internet. I use it myself, but that's why social media is not necessarily a good thing.
So you want to see a process of cultural assimilation within social media? There is cultural penetration. I mean, you go to I buy all my Indian pirate DVDs in Pakistan. They're cheaper, just for under $1. I get the whole range of them, and they're all over the place. And that kind of culture is penetrated deeply in Pakistan, despite the Taliban and despite the Jamaat, so forth. But and that's Pakistani and Indians aren't fully aware of this. I think Indians assume that Pakistan is this kind of monolithic burqa-clad society where people can't laugh or smile or anything. That's true of parts of Pakistan. I had once had a long conversation with Sam Huntington. I was just a young faculty member, and I invited a conference with Sam, and he had a Clash of Civilization book coming out. And I looked at the map, and I talked to him. I said, Sam, the line goes through Pakistan. It's not between Hindu and Muslim. It's in Pakistan itself. There's always been a civilizational war in Pakistan between east and west of the cities. And that war, the outcome of that war is a vital concern to the Indians, because they want the good-sized guys to win, not the bad guys to win. It's a vital concern to everybody, including Americans now. And he accidentally created this term "clash of civilization," which has been picked up by the Islamic extremists as a rallying cry. And that is a live conflict. And the Indians have as much at stake in that as we do, and that's why most Indians want a normal Pakistan, that kind of Pakistan. And popular culture is important in this. I agree. No. Yeah.
Any further questions? I think this is sort of.
Just perhaps a footnote on that one. Russia, talking about pirate DVDs, Russia's a great place for pirated Hollywood DVDs. Since the end of the Cold War, you could almost say that, to a great extent, Russian culture has been conquered by American culture. It doesn't mean they support American foreign policy.
Yeah.
So it's a different issue.
Yeah, there is a common South Asia culture which is denied both in India by some Indians and some Pakistanis. And the food, the literature, the ghazals, and so forth. It's very common. I saw a couple of episodes of it. Foodistan, the movie, the TV program, marvelous program. And the best part about it is that there's a disclaimer in the Foodistan: no beef or pork products were used in the making of this program. In a sense, they can reach a consensus even on food, where in the old days, riots were always started by somebody throwing a pig into a mosque or slaughtering a cow. I mean, that's the way you start a riot in South Asia. So that kind of popular culture is good. But I could see some crazy TV channel having live slaughter of cattle broadcasting it to India, or vice versa.
Television is pervasive. That influence is far more pervasive than any of the kind of social network sites and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So I think in South Asia, and especially in the rural parts, the television presence is far more influential than the web penetration.
Yeah.
Pervasive, but often pernicious.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
these kind of blogs that,
The technology is neutral, but the consequences can be profound, both positive and negative.
Right. I think we'll call this discussion to a close. Thank you, Anatol, for commenting on Steve's things, and thank you, of course, to Steve for what promises to be a really provocative and interesting book. We very much look forward to it, and to having you back here again at some point at King's. Yeah, thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Just to say, those of you who want, as a King's tradition, we're going to go down to the Lyceum for a pint. If you want to join us, please do. It's just across the road. It's directly opposite the Tesco's.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
No, not the whole, but other than that. Not because I'm Muslim, but I'm diabetic. Oh. I'm American.